The Norman and Florence Brody Family Foundation is dedicated to exploring topics of national and international importance and is proud to support Policy Watch with Doug Besheroff at the University of Maryland. From the University of Maryland, this is Policy Watch with Doug Besheroff.
Since its inception, the United States has been a destination for immigrants from around the world. However, U.S. immigration since the 1960s has been different from past waves in at least three important ways. First, the rise in immigration from Latin American countries, primarily Mexico, and Asian countries, primarily the Philippines, India, and China. Second, the increase in low-skilled immigration. And third, the increase in illegal immigration. Each of these issues raises challenging dilemmas for U.S. policymakers. Joining us to discuss the current state of U.S. immigration and prospects for reform is Demetrios Papademetriou, president of the Migration Policy Institute and co-author of Immigration and America's Future, A New Chapter. And now the host of Policy Watch, Doug Besheroff.
Demetrios Papademetriou, welcome back to the University of Maryland and Policy Watch.
It is nice to be back. Nice to see you again, Doc.
Right. And of course, it's always nice to have a University of Maryland alum and a former professor. What did you teach at Maryland?
Political science, probably comparative politics and international relations, but that was a long time ago. You're really pushing me.
Well, I have a very good research assistant. We're here to talk about immigration in the U.S. and how the government should respond. And I have this wonderful and thoughtful report that you helped write. It's called Immigration and America's Future. And we'll talk about this, but first, a little background. How many immigrants in the U.S.? Who are they? And so forth.
About 38 million. That includes our best estimates of the legally resident population.
That's about 12%.
About 12% of the population, roughly, yes, between 12 and 13%. About 50%, at least in the more recent years, 50% from the Americas, minus Canada.
And most of those Mexicans?
Mexicans and Central Americans. Mm-hmm. I mean, you know, the catchment area, if you will, is sort of the neighborhood, I like to call it. About 30 or so percent, a little over 30% from Asia.
India, Bangladesh?
India, not Bangladesh, India, Korea, Hong Kong, China. These are the biggies. The Philippines, you know, probably, you know, also very large. But then, of course, spread into the rest of Asia, including Japan and all that.
Now, my impression is that the non-Latin immigrants tend to have higher job skills, with some exceptions.
Right. Dramatically so. I mean, if you look at postgraduate and professional degrees, you know, among some of these communities, you know, you'd be hitting 50 and 60%, something that we Americans don't even dream about.
So I think what people don't see, because the media is filled with, and I hate to use ethnic stereotypes, but for this I think it's all right. The media portrays, you know, the Latinos, but if we're taping this in the Maryland, Washington D.C. area, if you go to Gaithersburg or Germantown, you see very large and prosperous immigrant communities. Some Latinos, but from all over the world, and you can see that they're professional. It's a professional class, and we never talk about that.
That's very correct. Just to give you a datum, even about the Mexicans, by some estimates, there are Mexican estimates, but we can't find anything to contradict these estimates. As many as 50% of people with advanced degrees from Mexico are in the United States working.
Sure,
okay?
But I wonder if there weren't the ability to come to the U.S., and you know, we say this about Castro's Cuba and so forth, that maybe the domestic pressures for reform would be greater.
Probably true, but it would take real effort to do that. You know, we don't really put our mind to too many things. in our country. And, sort of building our own, is not something that we try to do smartly or systematically. But to go back to, there is one datum, one piece of information, that is shocking. We said that there are about 38 million or so. I said, 50% the hemisphere, 30%. The rest, 20% is mostly Europeans, but probably 7 or 8% increasingly from Africa. The most shocking and revealing datum, however, is that from these 38 million, a third are people like me, people who have become Americans. A third are people who are either on their way to becoming Americans, they're legal, we call them lawful permanent residents. They may choose to become so or not to become Americans. And a full third of the total foreign born in the country are here illegally.
And they are mainly Latinos?
And they are overwhelmingly Latino.
I know that you've given a great deal of thought to what to do about that population, and the broad terminology word is legalization. But before we talk about legalization, let's talk about what seems to have been the major impediment to some kind of immigration reform, including legalization. And that was the feeling that the United States did not control its borders, and so whatever the merits of legalizing these 10 or 15,000 million, unlawful immigrants, it was just going to be repeated again the way it was 20 years ago and so forth. And so there was this pushback that said, wait, before we do this, maybe this is a good thing to do, we need control of the borders. Well, how little control do we have? Is it getting better?
We have more control than we think, not enough control to think that, to say that we really got it under control.
Now, is this is better in the last 5 years?
Better in the last, every, there are, think of them as continuing to put resources in a smart enough way and in significant enough way that, every 3 or 4 months, we actually palpably, measurably are doing better than 3 or 4 months.
Let's talk about the mechanisms. The fence, or whatever it's called?
The fence is symbolic rather than, sort of real. In other words, theoretically, it's only 2,000 miles. You can put 2,000 miles, you can do a triple fence and all that, you can keep up even birds out. Okay? But the biggest difference is people on the ground, it is intelligence, it is in a strange way much more cooperation with Mexican authorities than we even think, because people think that Mexico doesn't want it.
Why is Mexico cooperating?
Because they are trying to guarantee the rest of the relationship. And this is a contaminant. Illegal immigration is a problem. The relationship on trade, investment, and everything else with the United States is much bigger for Mexico than illegal immigration.
And they also have a southern border,
in which they repeat all of the mistakes that we make.
So cooperation with the Mexicans and more boots on the ground?
Oh, many, dramatically more boots on the ground. I don't know what the figure would be today, but I would bet you it's on either side, slightly on either side of 20,000. On its way to growing by 1,000. The reason we haven't grown that number even much faster is because of attrition. People go, they get the training, the job is not easy, and because they're so well trained, they get stolen by local authorities, by TSA, etc., etc. But it's continuing to grow.
Now the rap is we arrest or take these people into custody, and we just send them back, and then they come back again.
But it takes the second time or the third time that you try to come back, it takes several times before you can make it back in. I mean, if you're truly dedicated to this, okay, even today, and you're willing to try 6 or 7 times, and you're willing to pay, and you're willing to take chances, real chances,
and it's gotten much more dangerous.
Much more dangerous, then in all probability, you can make it through, okay? But then you may be stopped in the first 50 or 100 miles that you make it through. So there's no free pass any longer at the border. People still make it through, but no free pass or anything approaching
I can remember TV videos of young Mexican boys, I think, in San Diego, just rushing the border.
Yes.
It was really, that could make anyone into a worrier.
Yes, and I think it was legitimate for people. I mean, people got initially at the border, and then the rest of the country, they got freaked out by these kinds of videos. And at the end of the day, I think that a lot of the conservative politicians, who basically said if we don't get control over this, nothing else will be possible, were right. In effect, something that was denied and fought over, and people sacrificed whatever it is, their lives, 3 or 4 years ago, which was enforcement first. There used to be big debates about that.
Mm-hmm.
De facto, it's a non-issue today because enforcement is taking place. Again, we're not talking about 80 or 90% kind of success, but we're talking about substantial success enough to actually be able to say that 2 or 3 years from now we're going to get to a point where this will be a bit of a trickle. And a big country like us, if there are a couple of million people who are here illegally, okay, that's neither here nor there.
What about some secondary line of identification?
There is a secondary line. It's not particularly good. It's that form that you have to fill every time that you change jobs. It's called the I-9.
And I had to show up with a passport?
And you have to show either a passport, if you don't have a real hard identifier, you have to have a series of identifiers, but the passport is sort of like, or birth certificate, is enough to sort of take care of that. That's a paperwork kind of a thing, and the databases are not interoperable enough, et cetera, so this is not really how today, you can still do interior enforcement at the workplace. That's why several people, Democrats at that, have been calling for something akin to a national ID, although it would be a national worker ID.
Somehow I smell the interest of unions in that.
Very much so. Okay, but what I think has also happened, has grown dramatically, is interior enforcement that is boots on the ground.
Where's that?
And this is throughout the country. Something that, it's called ICE, I-C, very nice name, interior enforcement, and these are the people who basically go and they knock on doors, whether it's employers or others, and they say, all right, let's see who is here. The people who go after the bad guys, people who go after people who may or may not be bad, but they don't belong here. And that has increased dramatically. The budget of that agency and the number of people who are involved in that, 10,000 plus by now, is grown dramatically. So you have two things. Until about 5 or 6 years ago, we seem to be having an argument. Do you stop them at the border, or do you stop them at the employment place? And pretty soon we realized that you have to try to stop them at the border and at the employment place.
Now, some number of people come to this country on a visa, some number of terrorists, in fact. And it looks to me as if once here, as long as you have a source of funds, you are home free.
And that's, that's certainly the next frontier, if you will, and I don't know whether we'll be able to ever get close enough to make everyone comfortable in this regard. Before we get there, we have to make sure that once here with a visa, and once your visa expires, that you leave. This would be exit controls. We're not there yet, okay? And of course, the ultimate frontier is trying to figure out where these people are and what it is that they're doing here, and I don't think that we'll ever get anywhere near that.
So, I think you're right. If the question of control is addressed politically, then the next question becomes legalization. It becomes a little easier. How do we do it? Do we just say, thanks for coming, you're Americans?
I think the proper way to do it, and we're not going to get there, but we'll get part of the way there, is to think through of what are the attributes that we want of our immigrants. We want them to speak the language. I'm not saying, perfect English. okay, but speak the language. We want them to be able to demonstrate that they can survive in our economy. We want to make sure that they don't break the rules. Okay, they broke a basic rule, but you know that they don't break other rules, which involves taxes, you know, being lawful in all of your other activities. And we want them to make an effort to participate in the community. Guess what? All of a sudden, you know, we have 3 or 4 or 5 of the variables, the kinds of things that you would ask them to demonstrate in order to move from illegal status to temporary legal status to something else, which will be permanent legal status.
But I'm struck, and we're edging towards the question of integration or assimilation. And we Americans are so proud of, you know, we're an assimilating culture and so forth, and in large measure, you know, I think we are. But our government seems to do very little to foster this. My grandmother lived in this country for 55, 60 years and hardly spoke English. And
you speak the truth.
yeah. But when I look at how difficult it is to get into an English as a second language program, the lines, the waiting for people who want to learn English, and then we complain that they don't speak English. This has to be much smaller than the bailout. You know, we used to say than a war, but I'm sure it's less than a war, but it's also less than a bailout of half a dozen companies that we've just bailed out.
I think that, you know, the government really doesn't want to be in the business of spending money, okay? And there are some misguided priorities in terms of what's the best investments that one can make when it comes to immigration. And we're too much into either or, you know. You either got to put money at the border, you know, or you're going to put money on integration, language. And for a period of time, I think we have to do both.
But I've watched some of the foundations that fund you and some of the foundations that fund me put tens of millions of dollars into advocacy efforts, not just for preschool or for health reform. I don't think I've noticed even those kinds of places saying, let's do some more assimilation work.
Yeah, it's not there. And I think that if you ask them, they will probably give you an answer that won't satisfy you, which is, you know, first things first. Our number one priority is to legalize all of these people. And then once that happens, we'll start putting money into integration. But I think that you should be skeptical about it the same way that I am skeptical about it. There is a certain sense, you know, in certain communities that multiculturalism, you know, is sort of like the way that we should be going in these issues. And there are certainly an awful lot of young people, you know, who believe that.
Is it young people, or is it the people who get paid to be leaders?
Yeah, it's entirely possible that's the latter two. There is a professional class that is, you know, sort of a multiculturalist kind of professional class. And, you know, these people have perhaps an agenda, although I suspect that's not nearly as much, you know, agenda sounds like, you know, like too big of a word for me. But on the ground, in fact, you know, you have that sort of attitude about it. What saves the United States? And I don't want to take sides on multiculturalism or anything else. What saves us is that everybody knows, more than anybody else, the immigrants themselves, that if you're going to succeed in this country, you're going to have to learn the language, okay? You have to play by the rules and work hard. You know, there are examples of how you can succeed, you know, in different ways, but as a matter of fact, these are the ways that you succeed.
That's right, and we just ought to be making it easier. But I understand it's just an irony that in China, in Korea, in India, name any country, English has become the language of success. And people swallow hard, you know, but there you go. Thank you, Internet, thank you, TV, whatever it is.
And the good thing, the one thing that perhaps should make you and I feel a little more comfortable about it is that if you look at census data going back, you know, 100 years, the rate at which people learn language keeps increasing rather than decreasing. So all the evidence points out that despite all of these arguments that we're having, and despite the best efforts of some, to not play by the rules, if you will, or not play in the game, the facts are on the ground are that people learn the language, that, as somebody has put it, the cemetery in which we bury all of the rest of the world's language is doing just, a big business today, too.
And we don't have time to talk about it, but it's important to mention that especially for Latino and Hispanic immigrants, by the second, third generation, there are very high marriage rates with Caucasians, with every other group, and so actually we have a difficult time counting the number of Latinos in our country. Yeah. So, sure, it would just be nice to speed it up. Let's move before we end to, let's say we have control of the border. Let's say we've done something about legalization. Mm-hmm. Do we want to do something about the nature of the flow of immigrants coming in? We have a law now that seems, by accident or whatever, to emphasize family ties, and in some respects that's very important, but it's a little bit like a strand on a sweater. Each family tie brings another family tie, and that doesn't necessarily give you the kinds of immigrants that your nation needs.
And, that's a totally legitimate question and point. Comprehensive immigration reform must include reform of the legal immigration system. Some people get it, some people don't. If you're going to reform the system, you're going to have to really think about immigration as contributing to growth and competitiveness.
So do we say you have to have a bachelor's degree?
What you have to, I don't know if it's a bachelor's, I suspect that we need many more plumbers than we need people with literature degrees.
There are many in Poland who are trying to go to France and Germany, and if we could only invite them over here.
Yes. And electricians while we're at it.
For sure.
Okay, so the bachelor's degree, yeah, right. But, I'd like to have many more skilled people, who do all these trades that somehow seem to become very scarce here in the United States and most other rich countries. I think that we need to think hard about what is the purpose of the family immigration system, which means to me, and this is a personal opinion, that we have to reunify families. And I don't mean families because of someone's definition, my third cousin or my second cousin is important to me. If you're going to have a family reunification system, you could not possibly have spouses stay separated for 5 years simply because you have to bring the, sort of the first, children, and whatever. So you have to narrow the categories of family and be true to the principles. Children,
speed it up.
And speed it up. But at the same time, you have to open up significantly to skilled immigration.
And you would set categories?
I would set, what I would set and what this book argues is to actually, in a very gentle way, suggest to the Congress that maybe, they don't need to micromanage the system the way that they have, because that has become extremely sclerotic. Nobody wins. They can't change it. So create an independent commission whose only job is to look at what is happening in the labor market, to try to figure out, what the needs are, and to suggest, to recommend to the U.S. Congress, changes to the system, increase in numbers, the kinds of skills that we're going to need more of, and then develop the capacity to actually be able to figure out what happens as a result of the immigration choices that we make. And if we take that and we professionalize that, something that we've never done, and of course that would mean that the Migration Policy Institute will have to go out of business, then we actually can do much better in terms of using immigration to grow the economy and to compete better in the global economy.
We only have a few minutes, but let me ask you about a potential negative to what you just said, and I see it around, you see it in medical care, for example. Instead of investing in our own people and in our own medical schools, we are basically importing the doctors we need and the nurses we need. And it's not that there aren't people in this country who would go to medical schools if we had more places. In fact, as a percentage of the population, you may know this, the number of doctors we produce each year goes down. So the flip side of what you just said is that becomes a very good reason not to invest in our own people.
Then we'll lose the overall game. You know, we may win for a quarter, you know, but we're going to lose the game. So if you're going to stay competitive, you're going to have to produce the people. But a supplement has to come from the outside.
For sure, but we're talking here about a balance, and I get the last word. Our government has not shown the ability to reach the correct balance very often. Demetri, let me thank you for letting me have the last word. Thank you for a thoroughly engaging conversation.
It has been my pleasure, Doug. Good to see you again.
And to our viewing audience, thank you for tuning in. We hope that you'll send us any comments or questions or suggestions. It's PolicyWatch at UMD for University of Maryland.edu. And once again, thank you very much for joining us.
This program was produced by the University of Maryland, which is solely responsible for its content.
The Norman and Florence Brody Family Foundation is dedicated to exploring topics of national and international importance and is proud to support Policy Watch with Doug Besheroff at the University of Maryland.
We are PBS.